It's been 10 years since Naughty Dog released The Last of Us on the closing months of the PlayStation 3, delivering one of the best swan songs of an entire generation. But a remaster, sequel and remake later, PC players are now invited to journey on this rocky road of redemption, forgiveness and death. But buckle up, as this is going to be a bumpy ride.
I will not turn into one of those things.
Now, the game and engine were designed around the unique architecture of the PlayStation 3, specifically the SPEs, the PPEs, and vast internal bandwidth, access times, and overall parallelism. This made the machine very powerful but not easy to maximize, and this is why many of the best games on the hardware were exclusive to it. Although it was ported to the PS4, the core engine underneath was a modified version of that same PS3 design. Based on mass asynchronous work, even on PS4, Naughty Dog themselves had severe issues getting the game to run at 60 FPS. Maximising the CPU and GPU with a triple buffered rendering pipeline, porting this to an agnostic platform such as PC, and the increased challenges of a DirectX 12 API and the pipeline state objects, this new API presents over the custom and tailored PlayStation API are beyond the scope of this video. But suffice to say, it is an even greater challenge than the PS4 port. As such, we had some intrusive problems at launch, and 2 patches dropped in as many days from that release. At launch, the game would crash, often. I counted 12 separate crashes from start to reach the point where you meet Ellie, and this was on an AMD GPU, which, unsurprisingly, this game favours. Nvidia players got it worse, or at least based on my overclocked RTX 2070, where the game can still crash if you exceed the VRAM requirements, as it bleeds out into system RAM and hard page faults and other memory related issues arise, killing the executable mid-execution, even at 1440p DLSS with a mixture of high and medium settings. Now, when it comes to a technical review and discussion, context and data is king. So let's start with some positives on the port over to the PC. Now, the options menu is exceptional, offering a clear breakdown of each setting from a dynamic visual perspective, demonstrating what each setting will change and/or a clear split of the impact on CPU, GPU, and VRAM. Now, the VRAM impact is highlighted as a moving bar, and as you draw close, the game then starts to rely on the system RAM and shared pools of data more and more between CPU and GPU, a key architectural element of the PS5, and this is a key data point and context I want you to keep in mind.
There's the bridge. That's our way out of here. Hey, Ellie, slow down.
In addition, you have a great deal of settings you can change here, far more than normal, even on PC titles, including reflection resolution, frustum range, ray march, animation quality, and much more. Now, this is a double-edged sword though, as I'm sure many PC players will struggle with this and likely revert to medium, high, or ultra, and then amend the resolution. Nobody uses low, which is not the right thing to do here, but menu functionality, context, and layout is superb, and this extends to the sound, the controls, and other aspects of the title, offering a very tailored level of config for us all. The visual quality and presentation of the title is also up with the best we've seen this generation thus far, and if you have the hardware, the PC can scale above the PS5. Visual clarity, effect quality, and even frame rate can all exceed the PS5, but this is a big if on your hardware and not just the GPU. This is a very data-driven dynamic engine and game, and this can affect demands across your entire build, and the CPU is likely going to be the most obvious wall you'll hit, closely followed by VRAM and even system RAM. And finally, you can achieve a locked 60 FPS and even higher on a range of hardware, and this includes scaling down to the Steam Deck. And even the RX 580 tested here does a great job at 1080p mixed settings. So the options will allow a broad spectrum of hardware well below the PS5 to run the game at 30 plus FPS frame rates. This is bolstered further with both FSR2 and DLSS reconstruction choices, offering increased visual and performance choices across a huge swathe of GPUs. And even at 1080p, both solutions offer better image quality by and large over the native choices the PS5 uses, at least for its own modes. Now, this is slowly becoming the norm, and aside Intel's XeSS, I don't think the team could have done much better here. Sadly though, the game launched with some major issues that impacted the more positive view you got. after merely 3 days of patches. And much of this was memory changes and updates around heap and buffer management. Much of this analysis is based on the second of those two updates, version 1.0.1.6, and this resolved many of the most egregious problems. Just as this video was finished though, a further update dropped that mainly improved UI and UX bugs alongside an NVIDIA hotfix driver to resolve crashes on RTX 3000 cards. Again, highlighting that ramped complexity for PC between the driver and the API. Now from quick tests, the performance and visual clarity and quality is identical to my test here on that 1.6 version, but the biggest issue at launch was crashing, as I discussed at the start. And this is now resolved for AMD players, or at least, again, staying within the memory limits. After 3+ hours of constant play using this version, it's now fully resolved. And the same is on NVIDIA, but NVIDIA does still present more issues than AMD players, which highlights the split quality that each GPU player will get. By and large, even on my RX 580 GPU, the game scales well, has very minimal visual bugs, and runs well within the expectations of the hardware, CPU and RAM notwithstanding. The RX 6800 can exceed the PS5's offering with better than PS5 fidelity mode at ultra settings, but these are minor. Volumetrics, image sharpness and texture details can now be a slight increase over the PS5, but the game does not scale significantly beyond the PS5 version. The 16GB of VRAM for my RX 6800 is needed here though, with a 12GB card still likely being worse than the PS5. And backs up what we've been stating here for a while. 16GB of VRAM is going to be required to match or exceed the PS5 this generation, and The Last of Us only reinforces that. Covered in previous games such as Uncharted, Spider-Man, and even Forspoken. That said though, the memory requirements are too high at this point, but remember that memory is not just used for textures. As you increase the resolution, all other aspects scale accordingly, and this can have an extreme impact on performance. The PlayStation 5 shows us, with it likely being GPU bound most often in its 4K fidelity mode when unlocked to 40 FPS plus, and the same is true on all my GPUs here, with the RX 6800 at 4K FSR2 quality, ultra settings, running between 40 to 60 FPS, and with my Zen 3 5600X CPU having enough headroom to be close to but not quite the bottleneck here. This becomes the main anchor point though once we reach around 75 to 85 FPS. Now I validated this here with the game being just over 60 FPS in this clicker battle and a mix of high and ultra settings, but with the main CPU impacts in animation, object detail, shadow cascade all set to medium. 4K FSR2 quality, we are fully GPU bound with us struggling to stay north of 50 FPS in action here. But once we drop the resolution by 30% to 1800p, still FSR2, we now shift to the CPU being the bottleneck. We gain around 25% higher performance, so we have around 5, maybe 8% GPU performance left on the table, but CPU is now maxed out and close to 100% utilization. Again, you can see the parallelism here within the engine, as I mentioned at the start, is incredible, being one of the best I've tested thus far. And although I'm not sure it would scale so well beyond 16 threads, but the limit is now at that 80 to 90 FPS range, which is where the PS5's performance mode hovers just below when unlocked on a VRR screen, which it becomes likely CPU bound at that point. The main impact, I believe, is twofold. As covered in my previous games, the PS5 has a dedicated I/O management block, DMA and decompression hardware that means it can shift data, specifically textures, but also animation, sound effects, etc., without any CPU cycles being needed and get it on screen. And as such, here the Zen 2 CPU within the console is performing close to this Zen 3 5600X. Now this is not a surprise at all, as this data management, decompression, animation streaming, pathfinding, all of these impact the CPU, which has no such dedicated hardware and the API and additional overhead. Now in addition, this is where the memory demands now ramp up on the PC. It has to pull all the required data into system RAM from the hard drive and copy this back and forth between the VRAM and system RAM pools. Now these aren't likely going to be huge demands, and in fact the demand on a SSD and hard drive is very low on this game. this does increase the cost further on PC, along with complexity, and it means the PC demands much larger heaps than console. For example, the game takes approximately 1 hour to compile the PSO shader cache at first boot on my 5600X, and this can cause crashes as the committed system RAM can exceed 35GB and all 16GB of RAM, likely due to that vast Uber shader the game uses. We can see hard page faults during this process, and this was likely an early fix the team resolved with the patches to reduce the size based on total available and now stay within 16GB post the first patch. Now this machine has 32GB of DDR4 available. Adding to this, the game is running some debugging error trapping code, and in general, the system RAM requirements are too high. But they also exceed the suggested settings from the team. And it can be the main cause of the crashes and bugs, specifically on Nvidia GPUs. Most of the bugs doing the rounds, and even the ones I have had here and show, are a result of simply exceeding the limits of VRAM and causing page faults, which gives you missing textures, assets, and other data-related problems. Some of it though is the API and driver as well. See here on the hairpins missing the alpha channel and other composites, and then the bugs extend onto ground textures and other materials, all being missing or broken. The engine uses a deferred pass with a fat G buffer and Uber shader for all materials, decals and more, meaning on PC the distance to that data through the PCIe channels and the split pools of RAM, not to mention the huge changes in API to DX12, the Nvidia AMD driver element, all add up to a ton of complexity, and some of these bugs we saw in the early Spider-Man and Uncharted review code. Now I am sure the team are working on the entire memory management and data allocation code for the PC, and this will likely be a few weeks until this is resolved. And in fact, Nix's did exactly the same thing post the Spider-Man release, which took them quite a while but improved performance there post-launch. As such, the solution now is to lower the memory requirements on your machine and resolution to mitigate these high demands. That said, do not expect your 8GB GPU to run the same textures and quality as the 16GB PS5. Memory allocations will always be higher on PC than on console, and having half the space of VRAM, which is unified on PS5 as well, is only going to add to that. However, we can get close to the PS5 at 1440p FSR2 or DLSS and can still run high textures on characters or environments, which is closest to the PS5, but again, this is a dynamic allocation and you will still have lower quality on these cards in many areas. You cannot fit 10 gallons of water into a 5-gallon tank.
It's clear, Ellie. Come on down.
So what about that scaling and performance then? Well, taking the very best in my RX 6800 here at 4K FSR2 Ultra, the PC cannot lock to 60 FPS, but it can flip-flop between GPU data and CPU bound, meaning a faster GPU and or CPU would likely get us to a locked 60 FPS and beyond. But we are into top-end hardware that I do not have to test, and as such, much like the PS5's fidelity mode, we could cap to 40 FPS here and run a similar performance level with improved IQ over the PS5, which is around the expectation of a console exclusive designed around the hardware running on a PC with approximately 50% more GPU power. Now the performance mode on PS5 drops the resolution to 1440p, not FSR2 or any such solution. It has both modes here. Naughty Dog used their own TAA solution, but leaving all the settings the same, which are closest to high on the PC menu. As such, by dropping to high on PC, also at 1800p FSR2 quality, we can cap the game at 60 FPS if needed and gain a close lock to that throughout play with better IQ and similar performance over the PS5 in its performance mode. Now both machines will be CPU stroke data bound at this point, and really shows how well balanced the game engine is, with its async frame rendering targeting approximately 12 milliseconds frame time window, certainly on the PS5. Now this means my recommended settings for a machine like mine here, as you see on screen, and then if you have more power, then scale up the GPU for resolution even to native 4K if you've got something like a 4090 machine, and scale the CPU impactful elements up more if you have a more powerful CPU, which all fits expectations at this point. The caveat is those memory demands are higher as already discussed, so ensure that you have quite a large pool of system RAM. 32GB seems to be enough on this title, and certainly 16GB plus in the GPU space. From here, The RTX 2070 is next, and even at 1800p DLSS, it's too high at present with the bandwidth and memory allocations, meaning you have to drop textures to medium, which degrades image quality too much. The best choice is to run at 1440p DLSS quality, and then you can set environment and character textures to either high and medium or medium and high, depending on which one's more important to you, and effects and minor objects to medium. And this manages to stay within the 8GB VRAM space and reduce, if not stop, crashes, and the same for bugs, as these are caused or exacerbated by running out of that heap space. Now use these recommended settings for machines around this spec and you can achieve a variable 40 to 60 FPS performance level. Yes, the image quality is lower than PS5 even at performance settings and frame rates, but it's still good enough to cap at 40 FPS on a 120Hz screen. We do and can become more CPU bound at these settings on this machine, with my Zen 2700X being the bottleneck here, but we can test sections that is almost fully GPU bound to set expectations for what further patches might bring once they reduce the CPU cost. Here at native 1440p, we're fully GPU bound and pretty much at 30 FPS. Bumping to DLSS quality, we gain approximately 46% performance back to around 48 FPS or 20 milliseconds as a frame time. We are still GPU bound here, and at these settings, give or take 2 to 4%. So expectations on this GPU would be correct, with the PS5 being approximately 60 FPS locked here in its performance mode. Over this overclocked RTX 2070, it would remain around 40% slower than the PlayStation 5 and still have lower IQ and textures due to that VRAM restriction as discussed, although it is close enough at this point that you will not really notice those lower or missing materials that often. Beyond this though, the CPU becomes the bottleneck here, and even though this has 2 cores more, and therefore 4 more threads than my 5600X, they are maxed out just as well. The IPC and speed is not good enough, meaning more often than not above 50 FPS in this game on this CPU, you're going to be CPU and or data bound. My RX 580 8GB GPU still runs the game very well, except we're now at 1080p. You can therefore bump up characters and environments to high textures because you have a little bit more space left over. Others are a mix of medium and high, but again, a variable 60 FPS can be achieved with a decent CPU level, or a capped 40 FPS again on a 120Hz screen is also an option. It actually runs very, very well on my RX 580. And again, using FSR2, which improves the quality across both machines, you can gain around 20% performance back and get overall better image quality, but you do get some sacrifices on other effects such as shading quality and reflections and shadows, because FSR and DLSS reconstruct this from a lower base, which can cause dithered reflections and reduced shadows. This doesn't happen on the PS5 because it uses native buffers or half or quarter resolution depending on the effect.
I'm glad Marlene hired you guys.
What do you mean?
I know you guys are getting paid for this, but trying to say things.
Yeah, sure thing.
Bringing up the lowest rung in the portable PC that can, or in this case, sort of can. You see, the engine can scale, and I'm sure the team have a focus on getting it certified for Steam Deck, but right now, even if we drop to the lowest settings, 800p FSR2, we cannot lock to a stable performance level, even 30 FPS. The same issues covered impact the Steam Deck. CPU load is the highest, with it often being bound, even when exploring the game, as the constant streaming in and out into RAM, decompression, animation all tax the machine to the limit. And once in action, you can then have bigger 100 millisecond stutters, which can become fully memory bound and cause 50 millisecond limits per frame. Now, this could also happen on the RX 580 when you enter some sections, or it might even be a bug within the engine, as it uses many sector points in the game to spawn in new enemies, assets, set pieces, etc. And while this happens, the entire machine can just lock at 50 milliseconds, or as it presents here, 20 FPS. Once it completes, or you force the engine state model to shift to attack, as here, the loop is broken and the game resumes back to a variable performance rate.
Fireflies! Pin him down! Got him! Cover the exit! Oh, keep your head down.
Now, as you can imagine, with the current build, all of these issues are significantly worse and more impactful on the Steam Deck. Yes, you can play it and it will run the entire game as incredible as it still is. But I simply cannot recommend the game as it currently stands for the Steam Deck, as it is too much of a sacrifice even in handheld mode. Visually, it still looks good on the Deck screen, but blown up here on a 4K one, it doesn't hold up that well, with FSR2 at such a low resolution base having far too much work to do with far too little data. And in addition, it has a dead zone issue on the controller on the Steam Deck, compounded by the heavy latency the game has with the terrible frame rate, can impact the control and functionality of a great performing and playing title. It has signs that it will run well on the Steam Deck once optimized, but right now, that simply isn't the case. Taken and launch day, this was a bad and broken release, and had we reviewed it before then, my recommendation would have been to avoid it. The issues that plagued it before patches, from crashing, game-breaking bugs and general quality, were far below the quality PC players should accept, and certainly Naughty Dog should have delivered. But with subsequent patches applied and some sensible settings found and used, it is in a much better state. It's far from perfect, and the collection of issues stem from the 1 hour long compilation for shaders, the fact you can still get a few of these during your first play, the excessive use of system RAM is going to impact a good deal of PC players, and the fact the game does not have a better auto config in the menu to limit the settings causing impacts such as CPU, GPU and VRAM, something which the Steam Deck does for the texture settings, for example. Now, some of these basic features added would have made a huge difference, but possibly the most impactful issue is that the largest GPU vendor in the market had and remains with the most issues and bugs within the game. Now, no matter the reason for this choice and why it happened, the issue is they should have pushed the release date back a couple of weeks and ironed out most of, if not all of these. In the 3 days post-launch, they made a great step forward, so 3 weeks could have changed all of that. And I'm sure the updates will come that will reduce the memory and CPU costs to aid all, and maybe even improve GPU performance levels a little. As covered, aside the data streaming bugs and CPU demands, the game's overall performance is good, and well within expectations of the hardware it came from, and it's now running on. But as the saying goes, you never get a second chance to make a first impression, and it may be a tough mountain to climb for the great Naughty Dog studio to claw back the trust from that PC market. But we will be covering it again very soon, I'm sure, once they get it back out on the road.
Easy. Holy shit.
And that's another coverage of PC and console performance complete. Hopefully you enjoyed this exhaustive look at the issues and the positives around the Last of Us PC launch, what can happen next. And remember, if you like all things technical, pixel and performance related, then keep it IGN Performance Reviews, and we'll catch you on the next one.